Hello everyone. Welcome to today's story. What if a single gift could change your life? Diep, after a lifetime of loneliness, receives a secret gift from CEO James and his mother. But will fate take it all away when tragedy strikes? Stay tuned to see how love, loss, and hope collide. Don't forget to subscribe and help us reach 1,000 followers. Trust me, you won't want to miss this. Diep stood in the soft glow of the afternoon light, the breeze gently swaying the trees around her. Her eyes were fixed on the birthday cake in front of her, her heart racing as a wave of disbelief washed over her. This was the first time in her life she had ever received a celebration like this. She had never known the joy of birthday parties, never heard the words "Happy Birthday" from anyone close to her. Her life had been a lonely journey, filled with an absence of warmth and family love. James stood next to her, his presence steady and comforting. His eyes were filled with a gentle promise, as if he was offering her more than just a celebration. He was offering her a new beginning. His mother was there too, her smile full of kindness, radiating a sense of care and acceptance. The gift they had prepared for her wasn't just a material token, it was everything she had longed for: attention, care, and love. "Diep, happy birthday," James said softly, his voice carrying warmth that wrapped around her like a blanket. Overwhelmed, Diep couldn't hold back her tears. She stood silently, the emotions bubbling up within her as her eyes welled with tears. Though she didn't voice it, she felt something deep within her shift. For the first time, she felt truly seen, loved, and cherished. The love she had longed for all her life seemed to surround her in this moment, and she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude and hope. This was the beginning of something she had never allowed herself to believe possible. The day was cool, with light rain gently falling, the sound of raindrops tapping on the roof creating a quiet rhythm in the background. The atmosphere was calm, almost surreal, as if the world itself had slowed down to honor the moment. James gently led Diep outside, his hand holding a small box, which he had kept hidden until now. Diep, still in a haze from the emotions of the day, looked at him with curiosity. "This is for you," James said, his voice tender, a hint of nervousness in it. Diep hesitated, unsure whether she should open it immediately or wait. She was overwhelmed, unsure how to handle the love and attention that had been showered on her in such a short time. Slowly, she lifted the lid of the box, and inside was a delicate necklace, its simple design gleaming under the soft light. The small, shimmering stone in the center caught the light just so, radiating warmth and care. "This is a gift for you to show you how much you mean to me," James continued, his gaze never leaving her face. Diep's fingers trembled as she touched the necklace. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of everything she had never had. Someone who truly cared, someone who saw her. She had never imagined that anyone could love her this way, not after all the years of loneliness. Tears welled up in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of joy. She looked at James, her heart full of emotion, unable to find the right words. All she could do was nod, a quiet acknowledgement of the love she felt blooming inside her for the first time. As the evening unfolded, Diep and James sat together in the warm glow of the living room, the soft flickering of the candles illuminating their faces. The gentle hum of the world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the quiet rhythm of their conversation. Diep, still holding the necklace in her hand, couldn't help but smile as James gently leaned closer, his presence comforting and steady. It was as though the two of them had found a moment of stillness in a world that had once felt so chaotic to her. "How did you and your family meet, James?" Diep asked softly, her voice filled with curiosity and a hint of longing. James smiled, leaning back slightly as he recalled the story. "It wasn't anything dramatic," he said, his voice warm. "We met through some mutual friends. It wasn't love at first sight, but it was something we both felt over time." Diep listened intently, her heart swelling with emotion. She could feel the depth in James's words, the sincerity in his gaze. His love for her was not impulsive. It had been built on trust, understanding, and care. It was the kind of love she had always dreamed of, but never thought she deserved. "And what about you?" James asked, his voice gentle. "Do you see us together in the future?" Diep paused, looking down at the necklace again, her fingers tracing the smooth surface of the stone. Her thoughts were a swirl of emotions, but one thing was clear. She had never felt more certain about anything in her life. "I do," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "I hope we can build a future together." The warmth between them deepened, and for the first time, Diep felt a sense of peace. This was the beginning of something beautiful, something she had only ever dreamed of. The day had begun like any other, with Diep heading to work, the steady rhythm of her steps matching the quiet hum of the world around her. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft golden light over the fields she passed through. She had grown accustomed to the routine, but that day, something felt different, something felt wrong. As she walked along the edge of a narrow path, the ground beneath her feet suddenly gave way. In an instant, she lost her footing and tumbled, her body crashing against the rocky earth below. The world spun as she struggled to breathe, her heart pounding in panic. She lay there, gasping for air, the pain shooting through her body, especially in her abdomen. The thought that flashed through her mind in those few terrifying seconds was not her own suffering, but the safety of the child growing inside her. Her vision blurred as she tried to push herself up, but the pain was too much. She cried out, but no one was near enough to hear. The ravine she had fallen into was isolated, surrounded by thick trees and high grass. The weight of the situation pressed down on her chest, and she realized the terrifying truth. She was alone. For a few moments, Diep could only focus on her breathing, the steady rhythm of it a small comfort in the midst of the chaos. But the fear of losing the baby, of never seeing James again, overwhelmed her. She closed her eyes, hoping for some miracle, but the silence around her felt endless. At that moment, the thought of James and his family, their warmth and care, gave her the strength to stay conscious. She knew she couldn't give up, not now. James had been thinking about Diep all morning, his mind wandering back to their time together. He couldn't help but smile when he remembered her laughter, the way she would light up the room with just her presence. But as the day wore on, a creeping unease began to settle in his chest. He hadn't heard from her in hours, and it was unlike Diep to not check in after work. He tried calling, but the phone rang without answer. His worry deepened, and he decided to go looking for her. His mother, noticing the change in his mood, urged him to be careful, but he couldn't just sit and wait. "Something's wrong," he murmured, his voice tight with concern. James drove to the area where Diep often worked, his eyes scanning the familiar roads and paths. When he reached the edge of the field, he saw a familiar sight, the path where she usually walked. His heart raced. The thought that something might have happened to her gripped him tightly. He parked the car hastily, stepping out into the field, his eyes darting back and forth. Then, in the distance, he saw something. It was a flash of movement, a figure lying at the bottom of a ravine. "Diep!" he shouted, running towards her as quickly as he could. When he reached her, his breath caught in his throat. She was unconscious, her body battered from the fall. His heart pounded in his chest as he gently cradled her head in his lap, his hands trembling as he checked for any signs of injury. "Diep, please wake up," he whispered desperately. "Please don't leave me." James took a deep breath, pushing his fear aside. He carefully lifted her, carrying her back to the car with his mother by his side. They rushed her to the hospital, the minutes dragging on like hours. Diep's life, and the life of the child she carried, hung in the balance. All James could do was pray for her safety. The sterile smell of the hospital, the constant beeping of monitors, and the flickering fluorescent lights all felt like a dream to Diep. Her mind was clouded, and her body ached with a pain she had never known. She had no idea how long she had been unconscious, but when her eyes fluttered open, the first thing she saw was James, sitting beside her bed, his face filled with worry and relief. "Diep," he whispered, his voice breaking. His hand gently grasped hers, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You're awake. Thank God you're awake." Diep tried to speak, but her throat felt dry, and the words wouldn't come. Her mind was still reeling from the fall, from the fear that she might lose her baby, from the thought of never seeing James again. But now, as she lay in the hospital bed, surrounded by the quiet hum of medical machines, she felt a sense of warmth and safety she hadn't known before. "James, the baby, is the baby okay?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes full of fear. James's eyes softened, and he squeezed her hand tighter. "The baby is fine, Diep. The doctors say everything looks good. You're going to be okay." Relief washed over her like a wave. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the tears slip down her cheeks, tears of gratitude and relief. She hadn't realized how much she had feared losing the baby until that moment. The weight of the world seemed to lift off her shoulders. His mother arrived shortly after, her face filled with concern. She embraced Diep gently, holding her as if she were her own daughter. The love and care from both of them was overwhelming, and Diep couldn't help but feel a deep sense of belonging. For the first time, she felt truly part of something. "I'm so grateful," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I never thought I could have a family like this." James kissed her forehead softly, his voice filled with tenderness. "You have us now, Diep. You're never alone again." For the first time, Diep allowed herself to believe that she had found a place where she truly belonged. Surrounded by the love of James, his mother, and the family she had always longed for, Diep knew that no matter what came next, she would face it with them by her side. The days that followed were a blur of hospital visits, gentle care, and moments of quiet reflection. Diep slowly regained her strength, but her mind often wandered back to the day of the fall. She couldn't help but replay the fear and uncertainty, the way her heart had clenched with panic, thinking she might never see James again. But now, in the safety of his presence, she allowed herself to heal, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls, Diep looked up at James. He was sitting next to her, his arm around her shoulders, his presence a constant comfort. The world outside was calm, the sounds of the city muffled by the quiet of their home. It was in this stillness that Diep realized just how much had changed in her life. "I never thought I could feel this, at peace," Diep said, her voice soft, almost as if speaking to herself. "It feels like a dream." James turned to her, his expression warm. "You deserve peace, Diep. You deserve love, and you deserve to be happy." She smiled softly, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, everything seemed right. Everything felt like it had finally fallen into place. Her fears, her past, all the struggles she had faced seemed distant now. With James by her side and the support of his family, Diep no longer felt alone. She finally had what she had always longed for: a family, a place to call home, and a future filled with love and hope. Later that evening, they shared a quiet dinner together, the simple act of eating as a family grounding deep in the reality of her new life. For the first time, she didn't feel the weight of the past holding her down. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to dream of the future. As she looked at James, she knew that this was only the beginning. The journey ahead might not always be easy, but she no longer had to walk it alone. With the love and strength of her new family, Diep was ready for whatever came next. And as she lay her head on James's shoulder that night, she whispered, "Thank you for everything." James kissed her forehead softly, his arms tightening around her. "I'll always be here, Diep. Always." And for the first time in her life, Diep truly believed it.
Diệp phát hiện một cuộc trò chuyện giữa James và thư ký của anh, nơi cô nghe thấy thông tin về việc thư ký của James đang mang bầu. Cảm giác hoang mang và nghi ngờ trỗi dậy trong lòng Diệp khiến cô tin rằng James có thể đang bắt đầu một gia đình với cô thư ký. Trong khi Diệp tìm kiếm sự thật, James vẫn đang kiên nhẫn chờ cạnh cô, cố gắng giải thích nhưng không biết cách nào để gỡ những hiểu lầm. Sau đó đối diện với James lời giải thích, Diệp nhận ra rằng sự thật không phải như cô nghĩ. Dù còn nhiều lo lắng, cô quyết định tin tưởng James thêm một lần nữa và mở lòng với tương lai.